Yo, yo, yo. Michpan seco tlog deshpa. Mis saludos y respetos full blast. Greetings to all my gente out there. Hopefully everyone's having a good day. With that said, just in case you happen to come across my channel for the first time, please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Manny, and I'm the Jaguar Man. Mucho gusto. Just for the record, I don't know it all. This is a channel, homie, where we make homies, never break, and that there's consequences behind every action, you know? So, today I want to talk about the Afro-Mex. Yeah, man. And this is going out to everyone, you know, because sometimes people sound ignorant. They want to sit there and claim a certain nationality or certain race, and they don't even know what they're talking about. They just go what they saw in the movie or what their favorite rap star is talking about. And in reality, history runs deep, and it goes way back in the day, man. And history seems to be one of my favorite subjects because I believe that history repeats itself. Anyhow, so before, we kick it off, people that know already, that are regulars to my show, know that we got a little ritual before we, get into whatever topic we're going to talk about. I tend to get people to relax, kick their feet back, lean back, spark up their churrito, open up their pisto, and enjoy the show. So this is something that you hear all the time. Oh, I come from this race, from this nationality, and this is how we keep it, and this is how we are. We try to keep it pure. I stick to my own, and this, and wow, wooty woo. But in reality, there's nothing pure anymore in this world. I'm sorry to burst your bubble, pero hey, all you gotta do is do your little homework, look back on your nationality, your country, and you'll see that there's always a little Mickey, little ficky mix. Everybody's mixed with a little some. There's nothing wrong with that, man, because there's a lot of cultures that are beautiful. You just gotta give them the opportunity to get to know what they're about. Anyhow, so I hear some of my badass Mexicans, que puro Mexico, que wooty woo woo. But sometimes if they fail to notice that it's not just brown. To be Mexican, you don't just have to be brown. And I've learned this throughout history that we got Mexican güeritos, we got Mexican chinitos, we got Mexican negritos. Man, Mexico just a beautiful country that has indigenous beautiful people, and the list goes on. And that goes back to the Afro-Mex. People right away look at a black person, automatically they think, oh, he must be from Africa. He must be from Nigeria or some country out there. And fail to know, again, we ignorant, we don't educate ourselves. To be black from the outside does not mean that you're just African or eres negro. No. You could be Cuban, you could be Puerto Rican, you could be American, you could be Mexican. Yeah, you heard me, homie. I said Mexican. Yeah. And this is what we're going to talk about today. Just in case for the homies and homegirls that don't know, we do have Afro-Mex. Yeah, in Mexico. So before you go judging, if you don't believe me, you could always go on the internet and do your tarea, do your homework. But this Afro-Mex goes back to many years ago. Afro-Mexicans, also known as Black Mexicans, are Mexicans who have a heritage from Saharan Africa and identify as a single population. Afro-Mexicans include individuals descended from both free and enslaved Africans who arrived to Mexico during the colonial era, as well as post-independence migrants. This population includes Afro-descendants, people from neighboring English, French, Spanish-speaking countries of the Caribbean and Central America, descendants of enslaved Africans in Mexico. Throughout the century following the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire of 1519, a significant number of African slaves were brought to Veracruz, according to this historian. The census has estimated 200,000 enslaved Africans were kidnapped and brought to New Spain, which later became modern Mexico. The genetic legacy of Mexico's once significant number of colonial era enslaved Africans is evidenced in non-black Mexicans as trace amounts of sub-Saharan African DNA found in the average Mexican. In the 2015 census, 64.9% of Afro-Mexicans also identified as indigenous Amerindian Mexicans. It was also reported that 9.3% of Afro-Mexicans speak an indigenous Mexican language. Wow. I didn't know that. That's deep. This is going out to everyone that is ignorant, saying that, that stereotype that a Mexican has to look a certain way. And it's going out to also some of the Afro-Mex activists like Benigno, Gallardo do feel their communities lack recognition and differentiation by what he calls mainstream Mexican culture. I could see that, and how the mainstream Mexican culture doesn't really show love to the Afro-Mex. And I don't know why that could be. Like I said, I can't speak for everyone, but I'm shedding light on this Afro-Mex because I think it's part of the Mexican culture, and we're gonna see why. Because Mexico, I believe, has a few half black and indigenous presidents, Mexican presidents. Okay, so here we go. When slavery was, pretty much all over the world. Slavery in New Spain, which is considered Mexico now. Slaves landed in Mexico by ships. With Herman Cortez, those of you who know, brought many slaves with him. They landed on the coast of Veracruz. Enslaved Africans were brought to Mexico, especially by Portuguese and British slave traders. Afro-Mexicans engage in a variety of economic activities as slaves and as free persons. Mexico never became a society based on slavery, as happened in the Anglo-American southern colonies or Caribbean islands. Plantations utilized large numbers of field slaves. At conquest, Central Mexico had a large heritage organized Indian population that provided largely labor. Mexico's economy utilized African slave labor during the colonial period, particularly in Spanish cities as domestic workers. Although Mexico has celebrated its mixed indigenous and European roots, mestizaje, the word, Africans' presence and contributions until recently were not part of a national discourse. The historical record has been revised to take account of Afro-Mexicans' long presence in Mexico. European nations to supply enslaved Africans to Spain colonies in the Americas ensure that a significant black presence in Spanish America, including Mexico. The vast majority had their roots in Africa. Not all slaves made their trip directly to New Spain. Some came from other Spanish territories, particularly the Caribbean. There were slaves who were transported through ships from 1521 to 1810. The origin of the slaves is known through various documents such as transcripts of sales. To decide the sex of slaves that would be sent to the New World, calculations that include physical performance and reproduction were performed. At first, half of the slaves imported were women, and the other half men. But it was later realized that men could work longer without fatigue and that they yielded similar results throughout the month, while women suffer from pains and diseases more easily. Later on, only 1/3 of the total slaves were women. From the African continent, dark-skinned slaves were taken. Black slaves were classified into several types, depending on their ethnic group and origin, but most from their physical characteristics. There were two main groups. The first, called retintos, also called mulatados, of the lighter skin color when compared with other blacks, and were distinguishable by their yellow skin tone. The demand of slaves came in early colonial period, especially between 1580 and 1640, when the indigenous population declined due to new infectious diseases. They began to issue an increasing number of contracts between the Spanish crown and private slavers, especially to bring Africans to Spanish colonies. These slavers made deals with the Portuguese, who controlled the African slave market. Africans were brought to Mexico by Spanish conquistadores and were in the conquest. One is shown in Codex Entourage of Conqueror Herman Cortes. In the court of the conquest of the Aztec Empire, complied by Franciscan Bernardino, Nahua informants noted the presence of Africans with kinky curly hair in contrast to the straight yellow and black hair of the Spaniards. Mexicans anthropologists counted 6 blacks who took part in the Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire. Notable amongst them was Juan Garrido, a free black soldier born in Africa, in Portugal, who participated in the conquest of Tenochtitlan, a western Mexico. The slave of another conquistador has been blamed for the transmission of smallpox to Nahuas in 1520. Early slaves were likely personal servants or concubines of their Spanish masters, who had been brought to Spain first and came with the conquistadores. Just for the record, people say that the Spaniards conquered the Aztecs, but throughout history, you guys could do your homework. It was the smallpox that killed most of the Aztec people. While a number of indigenous people were enslaved during the conquest period, indigenous slavery as an institution was forbidden by the crown except in the cases of rebellion. In 1482 to 1568, who arrived in Mexico in 1524 to evangelize the Nahuas, considered blacks their fourth plague, in the manner of biblical plagues on Mexican natives. He wrote, in the first years these black overseers were so absolute in maltreatment of the Indians, overloading them, sending them far from their land, and giving them many other tasks, that many Indians died because of them, and harming indigenous women, mandating fines and 50 lashes in the plaza. In Mexico City in 1537, a number of blacks were accused of rebellion. They were executed in the main plaza, which is called Zocalo, by hanging, an event recorded in indigenous pictorial and alphabetic manuscript. They were Africans who achieved the normal status of vecino. And slave resistance. Black slave rebellions occurred in Mexico as in other parts of the Americas, with one in Veracruz in 1537 and another in the Spanish capital of Mexico City. Runaway slaves were called cimarrones, who mostly fled to the highlands between Veracruz and Puebla, with a number making their way to the Costa Chica region in what are now Guerrero in Oaxaca, slave trade, and the ways in which Latin America was involved. In the chapter titled The Slave Trade in the Caribbean and Latin America, they mention that Spain's biggest goal was to explore newly discovered tropical territories in order to help them gain resources and generate wealth and power. Runaways in Veracruz formed settlements called palenques, which would fight off Spanish authorities. The most famous of these was led by Gaspar Yanga. He entered Mexico because he was a slave who was working in the sugar plants. During the year of 1540, Yanga was able to escape this plantation in the year of 1579, and he left to hide in the mountains. There, Yanga founded a palenque. The only way that slaves who were in the zone could survive was by following each other's lead. The more slaves that heard about Yanga and his escape, they would create groups and would plan to escape their plantations their Spanish owners created. Their leader was Yanga. Since Yanga and his followers had created a community in the mountains, and they knew that the Spaniards only used certain roads to transfer goods, they planned to rob them. Yanga's followers would often hide and wait until the Spanish men would be passing by certain spots and rob their goods. Eventually, the Spaniards became afraid. The Spanish then declared war with Yanga and his followers, and they lost. So freedom was granted to Yanga and his army. With Yanga winning this war, he was able to speak and demand land from Spanish authorities. He wanted his people to have a town of their own, which was first known as San Lorenzo de los Negros, and they became the city of Yanga, Veracruz, the first community of free blacks in the Americas. In the 21st century, some people who identified as Afro-Mexicans are the children and grandchildren of neutralized black immigrants from Africa and the Caribbean. Based on your culture, history, and traditions, do you consider yourself black, meaning Afro-Mexican or Afro-descendant? By the 17th century, the free black population already outnumbered the enslaved population. Scholar Germán L. Benet records that the 17th century colonial Mexico was home to the most diverse black population in the Americas. Mexico City, built on the ruins of the Mexica capital city of Tenochtitlan, became the center for diverse communities. Catholic Spaniards led sensual raids beginning in 1569 upon these communities in order to maintain order and ensure the gender and conjugal norms that they, including persons of African descent, could assume in the Christian Commonwealth. The Mexican nationalist movement, which fueled the Mexican War of Independence from 1810 to 1821, was predicted on the ideological notion that was denied by the European imperial elites, who asserted that Mexico lacked any basis for nationhood, and resulted in the purposeful ensured of a black presence from Mexico's history. Scholar Germán L. Benet states that the demands of a previous political movement should no longer sanction the ideological practices that historically include the black past and presently confines into the margins of history, likening this ensured to an act of ethnic cleansing. Afro-Mexicans and the Catholic Church. Catholicism shaped life among the vast majority of Africans in colonial society. Enslaved blacks were simultaneously members of the Christian community and private property of their owners. In general, the church did not take a stance against African slavery as institution, although Dominican Friar Bartolome de las Casas later in life campaigned against their forced servitude, and the second Archbishop of Mexico argued against it and viewed the benefits of incorporating Africans into Christianity as slaves not equal, rending their ties to family in Africa. His pleas and condemnations were ignored. Church records and baptisms, marriages, burials, and the Inquisition indicate a high level of the church's formal engagement with Africans. Enslaved and free Africans were full members of the church. As the African population was increased with the importation of white elites became concerned with controlling slaves' behavior and maintaining Christian orthodoxy. With the establishment of the Inquisition in 1571, the church intervened in favor of the enslaved individuals over the objections of their masters in martial conjugal rights. Slaves learned how to shape these religious protections to change masters' authority through common law, thereby undermining masters' absolute control over their enslaved property. Blacks and Afro-Mestizos formed and joined religious brotherhoods under the supervision of church, which became religious and social spaces to reinforce ties of individuals to larger communities. Economic activity. Important economic sectors such as sugar production and mining relied heavily on slave labor during that time. After 1640, slave labor became less important, but the reasons are not clear. The Spanish crown cut off contacts with Portuguese slave trades after Portugal's gained its independence. Mestizo population increased, and with them the size of the free labor force. In the later colonial period, most slaves continued to work in sugar production, but also in textile mills, which were the two sectors that needed a large, stable force. Neither could pay enough to attract free laborers to its work. Slave labor remained important to textile production until the later 18th century, when cheaper British textiles were imported. Afro-Mexicans and race mixture. From early in the colonial period, African and African descendants people had offspring with Europeans or indigenous people. This led to an elaborate set of racial terms for mixtures, which appeared during the 18th century. The offspring of mixed race couples was divided into three general groups: mestizo for Spanish, white, indigenous, mulatto for Spanish. Black mestizos account for less than 2.5% of the Mexican population as of today. In addition, skin tone further divided the mestizo and mulatto categories. Afro-Mexicans and Mexican independence. The armed insurgency of independence broke out in September 1810, was led by the American Spanish secular priest Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla. Hidalgo did not articulate a coherent program for independence, but in proclamation condemned slavery in the slave trade and called the abolition of tribute. He remanded in November 1810 that slave masters must, whether Americans, New World born, or Europeans, give their slaves liberty within 10 days. Hidalgo was captured and executed in 1811, but his former seminary student, secular priest Jose Maria Morelos continued the insurgency for independence. He did articulate a program for independence in the Sentimientos de la Nación at the 1813 Congress of Chilpancingo, that also called the abolition of slavery. Point 15 is that prohibit slavery forever. Morelos, like Hidalgo, was captured and killed, but the struggle for independence continued in the hot country of southern Mexico under Vicente Guerrero, who is portrayed as having African roots in modern Mexico. Iguala, named for the city in the hot country where it was proclaimed, laid out the aims and insurgency calling for independence, the primacy of Catholicism and monarchy, with point 12 mandating all inhabitants of the empire within any distinction other than merit are citizens fit for whatever employment they choose. And Mexico gained its independence in September of 1821. Despite political independence, abolition of slavery did not come about until Guerrero became president of Mexico in 1829. Conflict with the U.S. over expansion of slavery. Although Mexico did not abolish slavery immediately after independence, the expansion of Anglo-American settlement in Texas with their black slaves became a point of contention between the U.S. and Mexico. The Northern Territory had been claimed by the Spanish Empire, but not settled beyond a few missions. The Mexican government saw a solution to the problem of Indian attacks in the north by inviting immigration by U.S. Americans, rather than settling in the territory contest by northern Indian groups. The Anglo-Americans and their black slaves were established farming in eastern Texas. Mexican President Anastasio Bustamante, concerned that the U.S. would annex Texas, sought to limit Anglo-American immigration in 1830 after Mexico refused to acknowledge the independence of the territory until after the Mexican-American War of 1846-1848. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo drew the border between the two countries. After the defeat by the U.S., Mexican President Jose Joaquin de Herrera sent a bill to Congress to create the state of Guerrero, named after the mixed-race hero of independence from parts of Michoacán, Puebla, and Mexico, in the hot country where the insurgent leader held territory. Mexico became a destination for some black slaves and mixed race. They were free once they crossed into Mexican territory. Many of the prevailing views on blackness during the early 20th century held that the race would eventually go extinct through voluntary assimilation. This belief held that Afro-descended peoples, along with the other races, would eventually combine into a cosmic race. In the beginning of the 20th century, Mexico was known to be a safe haven from racial discrimination, especially to Afro-descended citizens of the United States who would seek refuge there. Notably, famous boxer Jack Johnson fled to Mexico in 1919 and claimed it as a safe haven from racial prejudice. Beginning in 1925, the Mexican Ministry of the Interior began limiting immigration. By the 1930s, some officials were encouraging immigration only from those they deemed to be of good racial backgrounds. Even travel to Mexico was limited, and those applying for tourist visas could be denied access to Mexico based on their race until around 1939, contradicted the image that Mexico wished to present about their racial equality. In the beginning of the 20th century, Mexico was known to be a safe haven for racial discrimination, especially to Afro-descendants, citizens of the United States who seek refuge there. Mexican scholars like anthropologist Colanzo Aguirre Beltran helped begin the process of recognizing Mexico's African culture influences, as well as making the populations more visible and relevant. Aguirre Beltran became a leading Mexican scholar on Afro-Mexicans. He wrote a book, La Población Negra de México, which helped form the foundations for the study of Afro-Mexicans during the colonial period and their post-revolutionary cultural impacts. Even while he was promoting black visibility, Aguirre Beltran circulated his ideas that there existed no individuals with pure African heritage in Mexico, and that blackness in isolation was violent and aggressive. During the 1940s, the question became how to define Afro-Mestizo populations and distinguish them from indigenous communities. Even if one can identify an individual as African descendant by their physical characteristics, they were culturally mixed and could not be easily separated from the larger population by their cultural practices. Black communities in Mexico were being officially recognized by scholars, and the existence of Afro-Mestizo populations could no longer be denied. Yet it was not until 2015 that African descendant was added as a census category for official government recognition of Afro-Mexican populations. Runaways and slave rebellions began early in Veracruz, with many escaping to the mountains areas in the west of the state near Orizaba and the Puebla border. Here, groups of escaped slaves established communities called palenques. Because African descendants dispersed widely into the general population, African and Afro-Cuban influence can be seen in Veracruz. Music, dance, improvised poetry, magical practices, and especially food. Veracruz son music, known as son jaracho, and best known through the popularity of the hit La Bamba, shows a mixture Canary Islander and African influence. You see that we all have a little bit of each other, man. Right about now, there's nothing pure. So people out there from any other race that thinks that you're pure and this and this and that, nah, man, we're all mixed. So we got the Cubans influencing a lot in Mexican culture as far as music, dances, the poetry, magical practices. As you see, a lot of Mexicans practiced voodoo, Santeria, which comes from Africa, and so on and so forth. Towns in North Mexico, especially in Coahuila and along the country's border with Texas, also have Afro-Mexican populations and presence. Some enslaved and free black Americans migrated into northern Mexico in the 19th century from the United States. A few of the routes of the Underground Railroad led to Mexico. One particular group was the Mascogos, a branch of black Seminoles originally from Florida who escaped enslavement, and free black Americans intermingled with Seminole natives. Many of them settled in and around the town of El Nacimiento, Coahuila, where their descendants remain. Afro-Mexicans speak up. These are a few things that African influence on Mexican culture. Bananas and plantains. Both bananas and plantains originate from East Asia, but by the time of European colonization, they were readily available on the African continent where they would make their way to the New World. Bananas were reported in Mexico as early as mid 1500s. Cowpeas, the main variety of which being black-eyed peas, are another uncommon crop of Mexico. But the in the state of Guanajuato, where they are called vericonas, cowpeas originate and were domesticated in West Africa and made their way to the New World. By the 1500s, the state of Guanajuato was noted for its large African population, where by 1580, roughly 800 slaves were reported working in a singular mine. Okay, let's go to the arts. The first documented visually recorded, there is clear depictions of them as active individuals in their own agencies. As Mexican history progresses, African influences and visuals of black bodies persist through Mexico's movement toward independence in 1810 notes that 10% of the population of being African descended. As Mexican independence prevails and Mexican racial and national identity found itself, a visual image of the Mexican identity is often created without black individuals in mind. Mexican muralism was one artistic movement that did create space for the Afro-descended. Muralist Fernando Leal was one artist who engaged with the prospects of race being discussed in the typical of Afro-Mexicans. Artist Fermin Revueltas between 1922 and 1923 also painted a mural for discussion while depicting the Virgin Mary as black. Music. Okay. Son Jarocho. Son Jarocho is a regional folk musical style of Mexican son from Veracruz, a Mexican state along the Gulf of Mexico. It is the fusion of Spaniard and African musical elements, reflecting the population which evolved in the region from Spanish colonial times. La Bamba. La Bamba is the classic example of the Son Jarocho musical style, which originated in the Mexican state of Veracruz and combined Spanish, indigenous, and African musical elements. The song is typically played on one or two arpa jarochas harps, along with guitar relatives, the jarana jarocha and the requinto jarocho. The word bamba is derived from kimbundu, mbamba meaning master, as in someone who does something depthly or skillfully. Ahí está. We're learning something. I thought La Bamba came from Pacoima. Mexican cumbia, although its roots are Colombian, cumbia is the popular genre of music in Mexico. The word cumbia derives from West African vocabulary. Cumbia originates as the musical synchronism between instruments and traditions from the Afro-Colombian palenques, indigenous Colombian musical traditions, as well as European influence. It is understood that cumbia first originated as a courtship dance and further developed to envelop expression and resistance during the transatlantic cultural exchange. Yeah, so this is a little history on You know, the influence of the Afro-Mexicano. We got a lot more stuff here, but not enough time. I don't want to put you guys to sleep, but you guys could always look it up. There's stuff on colonial era figures, politics, entertainment, visual arts, sports, fictional figures, so on and so forth. The influence and power that the Afro-Mex has in Mexico and throughout the world. If I've learned something new, I hope you guys did as well. Like I said, this channel, we're about making homies, educating each other. I know that there's homies out there that got their heads out their ass and are willing to learn a little bit more than just what we know, the hood, the pinta, drogas, and we gotta rise up, level up, and wise up, homies. With that said, my name is Manny. I'm the Jaguar Man, and much love and respect. Stay tuned for more, por favor. If you're new to the channel, subscribe, homie. It don't cost nothing, dog. Homegrown. Welcome. Much love and respect. You guys have a good night.